So we've got two speakers today, but before bringing up David Footman from Ubisoft, we're going to have a presentation that Peter Kuplowsky is going to be putting forward. So I'd like to introduce Peter first. Peter is both a film curator and a film producer who's worked with the Fantastic Fest in Austin, also with the Toronto International Film Festival, and he's got about a half-hour presentation that'll then follow into a sit-down discussion between the two. So thank you, Peter.
So this is a presentation. I'll provide some context to it because it's kind of came out of a weird situation. I worked for 2 years at the Toronto International Film Festival, specifically for a program called TIFF Nexus, which was TIFF's initiative to sort of get the organization more involved with gaming. But a part of that was actually convincing leadership that gaming had anything to do with film, and that as a film organization, why do we care about video games and why is it important? And so I actually ended up coming up with a presentation for them in which I kind of just ran, and I only had, at the time, 10 minutes to kind of go through the history of video games and summarize specifically how video games and film have intersected. And so I'm going to say up front, this presentation is not exhaustive. It's more of a survey on how these two mediums interact, and I'll be covering a few examples, and I'll be jumping back and forth from modern to retro content, from mainstream to more independent and esoteric games. And I'm not making a case for all type of video games. My focus is generally on games that are concerned with narrative and which unravel narrative through visual grammar, which I see as being adopted and evolving from that of cinema. So to begin, the impulse to find cinema in video games is somewhat self-evident. I think we only need to look to the origins of both mediums to observe some literal continuities. You can see here Edison's kinetoscope parlors and the arcade parlors of the 1980s. And then more fundamentally, both mediums are audiovisual entertainment whose content is largely representational. So video games, much like movies, involve spectator positioning, point of view, semiotics. Pretty much all theories dealing with images and representation can be applied to the study of video games, just as they can to cinema. This is largely because both films and video games represent the world through an analogous apparatus, the camera. In video games, the camera is virtual, but I think considering the proliferation of digital cinema and virtual cinematography, the distinction of whether a camera is a tangible object and is actually recording a pro-filmic reality is kind of a moot point. They're both tools in which we're capturing images, be they virtual or real. And accepting this analogy, one might begin to observe a parallel in the treatment and evolution of screen space between, say, early cinema and early gaming. And communications theorist Mark J. Wolf does just that in a great paper called Inventing Space. So cinema has an arrival, has the arrival of the train, the first film, and it's a static shot, and video games have space war, which is also a single and stationary perspective of a moving image, an interactive moving image. And then Wolf constructs a whole taxonomy of video game screen space in this paper. He likens the space of Defender to the panning in Edwin Porter's Life of American Fireman, as you can see here. And then subsequently he compares D.W. Griffith's alternating editing patterns as comparable to the cuts between neighboring spaces in Atari's Adventure. We understand what's going on in this excerpt from Adventure because through the principle of match on action or match on avatar, we understand how these spaces relate to each other. And now I'm going to go to another example, slightly more modern, and it's from Resident Evil, a game. Though inspiring movie franchise already behaves like a movie from the onset. As an adventure, though, the player navigates through a series of fixed camera angles linked through the conventions of classical Hollywood editing. But now the composition is even more dynamic and considered. The game's director, Shinji Mikami, consistently frames each shot with the player's avatar starting far away from the camera, creating a feeling of vulnerability. There's always a gap between player and his avatar. That gap is repeatedly filled with antagonists, zombie dogs in this case, and the very composition of each angle contributes to visual tension. Anecdotally, Mikami went as far as studying George Romero's Night of the Living Dead and planning the camera angles for this game. So already we can see how cinematic grammar is being applied to the very compositions of video game images. And now when you arrive with more complex and sophisticated 3D spaces, the virtual camera is typically afforded more mobility to aid in a player's navigation, and many games tether an adjustable camera that pivots around the movement of the player in a 3D space. And in the case of a game like Super Mario 64, which was one of the first games to do that, the cinematic apparatus is literally foregrounded from the start, with the virtual camera aligning itself with the perspective of a fictional camera, one being carried, as you saw in that brief moment, by a turtle in a puff of cloud. It's this abstract idea that immediately explains to the player how our relationship is with our avatar and how it's being mediated through a figurative cinematic lens. And of course, interactive cinematic montage persists with the mobile frame, and so a game like Grand Theft Auto, players can cycle through different cinematic angles. Some of these serve no navigational purpose. They're just merely pursuing a recognizable cinematic perspective. It's just footage from Max Payne, which also is steeped in visual cues from cinema, where players can slow down time and are rewarded with visual moments. This is a game which mediates the feeling of DV video. So now even the texture and aesthetic and cinematic cues of DV video are sort of being applied to a video game for not a verisimilitude that is a realism, but one of cinematic verisimilitude. And now conversely, the player's actions within these games may be cued by what they do. So if you're playing a game like Metal Gear Solid and you lean up against a wall, the camera is going to adjust to a specific position to offset you so you can see the space line ahead. I'm sorry I don't have a visual example of that. Actually, let me just pull it up. I might actually have one. Yeah, I did download that, cool. Yeah, so like here's an example. So the camera is adjusting based on the based on the player's movement. So when they lean up against this wall in a second, the camera automatically shifts to a perspective in which allows them to see what's going to happen. But at the same time, it also creates a dramatic frame. It generates suspense, anticipation, especially if an antagonist is on its way around the corner. And what I mean to emphasize by offering all these examples is just as a filmmaker has their close-ups, master shots, snap zooms, tilt shot, reverse shot structures, so too does the game developer. They have a tool set of visual grammar from which to pull from and which can offer to the player the ability to use, and this is a grammar steeped in cinematic traditions of devices. And I can see it working the other way around, where you can have a visual idea that begins in film, get expressed and remediated in a video game, but then you can then see that video game variant of it then get sort of remediated in film again. And one example would be, if anyone's seen the film Speed Racer, there's a whole episode at the start of the film where the main character is having a race with a ghost car. It's literally a transparent image of another car from an earlier race, and this is an image that only sort of really makes sense to someone who's played video games and recognize the image of a ghost car being a previous gameplay, so that you can measure whether or not you're able to beat yourself in games and in the game. And so I thought it was interesting how a video game might construct a visual idea that they're getting from cinematic grammar, and then video game grammar in turn appears in film. And one cinematic tradition that I'd like to definitely talk about, and which video games frequently employ, is that of the subjective shot, as employed by Hitchcock, films like Lady in the Lake and Dark Passage, or the mechanized gaze of The Terminator and RoboCop. But the thing that's interesting about these shots is that in film, they're the most alienating, artificial, and jarring of camera setups, because they call attention to the very apparatus and artificiality of film production. But in video games, it's the opposite. The player's agency over that shot allows them to identify more easily with the image, and they become a disembodied eye, an eye that can wander undisturbed. And first-person games that employ this continuous roaming perspective in many ways achieve a cinematic ideal per Andre Bazin's theories from the Cahiers du Cinema. He was a theorist who saw cinema as perpetually moving towards a total verisimilitude that afforded the spectator complete freedom to explore framed reality. And this ideal is largely realized in first-person games like those of the Half-Life series. And I'm going to show a clip from Half-Life 2 and discuss it with you.
Welcome. Welcome to City 17. You have chosen or been chosen to relocate to one of our finest remaining urban centers. I thought so much of City 17 that I elected to establish.
So we can observe that the frame is wide, everything's in focus. The players afforded the ability to move around and look at whatever they sort of please, but at the same time, just turn it down a little bit, their gaze and directory is still directed as it would be in a film. There's simultaneously no frame, and yet frames abound as the player moves and penetrates through the space, constructing close-ups, medium shots, establishing vistas. And even in a game like this, I see, for my Speed Racer example, I see how this is a game that was influenced, has sort of shot compositions that I feel were very much influenced by films like Terry Gilliam's Brazil. There's a shot coming up, and I'll have an example to sort of visually correlate that. It's very much reminiscent of that movie, but then at the same time, a filmmaker like Alfonso Cuarón, I'm convinced, played this game before he made a film like Children of Men, which depicted similar dystopia imagery, and dystopia imagery in which he had everything sort of visualized in this continuous Byzantine form of realism. Here's the Brazil shot here. No, this is just an example of the sort of aesthetic similarities. This is the shot from Brazil, where there's a whole first-person sequence which the character is being moved through a dystopia. Now, I find it very telling that each of the Half-Life games seem to evoke cinema's origins at the outset. I mentioned the first film, The Arrival of a Train. Well, almost every Half-Life game begins with the arrival of a train. And like the promise of the Hales tours of 1905, the video game promises a voyage into a world of enacted perception of a fiction that we feel we get to participate in. And the Hales tours were these rooms that simulated a train ride. You basically walked into a room, there's a movie screen at the other end, and everyone was like, oh, it's like we were on a train. And everyone was very excited about this at the time, even though you didn't get anywhere and you weren't changing the outcome of the moving image in any effect. So it was both an interactive ride, but at the same time, you weren't really affecting anything. But I'd like to point out that, are we really affecting things in video games? I mean, granted, they're interactive, but while video games offer tangible participation with an image, the player is often never afforded total control of the experience. They're always directed. The very presence of rules and systems in games implies that one control is rarely total, and it's a fallacy that interactivity precludes authorial control. And Half-Life 2, I find, foregrounds a train because of this fundamental truth to the medium, and the train operates as a metaphor for both the narrating theme and the narrating architecture, the mechanics of the game itself. Playing the character, Gordon Freeman, who's ironically named, the game directs a player through a set piece after set piece, and as the game goes on, the player learns that their protagonist, their avatar, that they are controlling is in turn being controlled by a force within the game's narrative itself. And so narrative conspiracy is laid on a meta-conspiracy of the game design. Meaning and doing transpire in the same gesture. The game itself functions as an allegory of control, appropriate for the game's dystopic setting. But I also feel like allegories of control is what most video games are, and it's why video games engage in conspiracy narratives. It's why video games frequently cast protagonists as soldiers or characters that exist in situations or narratives that require systemic rules and people giving you orders, just because it allows the player to more to feel more a part of that experience, and to feel like because they're following the rules of the game is basically convincing them that they want to follow the rules of the game. So I'm going to show another example from Half-Life in which the game is actively encouraging you along and getting you to move where it wants to go, not because you realize that you made a decision, but because the game is making it the only decision, simply because you don't want the game to end. So I mean, right there we've got a great frame that feels highly cinematic. The game discourages from going that direction, and because we saw characters in there, we decided, oh, we're going to investigate that space.
Was that you knocking? I didn't even know we still had a door. Oh, I thought you were a cop. This is how it always starts. First the building, then the whole block. They have no reason to come to our place. Don't worry, they'll find one.
Anxieties underlying your concerns, rather than trying to answer every possible question you might have left unvoiced. Consider the fact that
I can't take it anymore.
Everything's gonna be okay.
What are we going to do?
We'll think of something.
simple fact has far-reaching
Oh, that's all the clip I have. All right, so of course, now say the player was to do something that the game didn't want it to do. Say the player was to defy the rails of the game and spin around in circles or just hop up and down, which gamers do, players do. And I might ask the same question though of a film spectator. What is to prevent a film spectator from not consciously deciding to disengage with a movie or to imagine a distinct context towards the images in front of her that the movie didn't want it to think? And I think it's instructive to recognize that one's interaction with art, be it passive or active, can always be very much likened to the systems and rules of a game. To watch a narrative film is to enter into a fiction in which we either choose to engage with or rebel against. Bernard Perrin has a great essay called Anaconda, which is about a review of the movie Anaconda, in which he basically comes up with the meta rules to watching a movie. The rules that you enter into, the contract you enter into to enjoy a film, and rules that you don't necessarily have to follow. No film comes with an instruction booklet. We just understand this is how we watch movies, this is how we understand movies. And the point I'm trying to make is that both cinema and video games are fraught with an underlying tension of freedom and constraint. Despite the limitless access virtual reality might offer, games like the kind of discussing and games that seek to emulate a cinematic narrative experience do stroke by constraining a player's space of play in order to generate a limited but highly immersive sense of agency. So while failure, like having your character die in a video game, may cause the game's story progression to stall or delay, the player of these kinds of games will invariably find themselves on a path the developer both anticipated them taking and actively guiding them to take. Again, it's this idea that I think what great cinematic video game design is game design in which gets the player to do things that the game wants them to do that the player didn't realize that they were being told to do. They just wanted to do those things because they wanted to see those things happen. And so in a sense, the player is kind of a spectator / performer. And this is where we come to a medium-specific distinction. Unlike cinema, the active identification has a twofold effect in games. We don't just project upon characters, but we enact their decisions and actions. We're complicit with them. And so, to be fair, these actions are typically dictated within a narrow range of possible options, but nonetheless, by performing these actions, which could simply be a button push, we become complicit in the outcome of a narrative rather than merely be witness to it. And I think a great game that I can sort of tease this out a bit further is The Shadow of the Colossus by Fumito Ueda. It's an adventure game, minimalist in form, nearly wordless, and it tells a story mostly visually through cinematic language. The player plays a young man who must slay 16 monsters in order to bring a princess back to life. It's been notable for the emotional response it gets out of players, and I feel like the effectiveness can be attributed to how cinematic form and set intersects the gameplay. There's a very sophisticated camera system that remains interactive throughout the game. Even in cinematics, the player can adjust the frame, zoom in, and it never fails to arrive at a spontaneous, stunning composition. The montage of the gameplay, the camera is either intelligently reacting to a player's movements or triggering a particular advantageous composition with just the push of a button. And when the director or the game does wrestle control over the camera, or significant control, it's when the monsters are defeated. And it uses cinematic language to change and recontextualize the situation. So here's an example of a fight from Shadow of the Colossus, and we're just gonna watch it play out, and then I'll just talk about what it's doing. So the camera shrinks far from the action, the game goes into slow motion, the soundtrack is deeply melancholy, the player's empathy with these creatures is created through this cinematic form of persuasion. It's an empathy machine, but it's more profound because we feel directly responsible for why this image was created. And even though we know that the game is on a track, we can sort of feel that the game is on a tragic trajectory, and that with each monster we kill, it's going to feel a little sadder. We keep doing it anyway because we want to see this narrative play out. And so at the same time, the reason this performative dimension is so emotionally loaded is just we're being witness to a number of cinematic cliches that we recognize and we respond to, and these cinematic elements harmonize with the game form. And so we feel sad we might otherwise have felt victorious after defeating an obstacle. Now, having parsed some of these ways in which cinema intersects video game narratives, and how the intersections can yield a kind of interactive cinema capable of formal expression, I will now consider the most literal intersection, one that will get us into our panel discussion, and that is the cinematic. As the name suggests, cinematic is the literal embedding of cinema within the frame of a game, also known as cutscenes. They're isolated movies that frame the events of this game or serve as milestones progressing the game's story and resetting the board for the next stage of play. They can be rendered using gameplay graphics to create scripted events, or through other conventional means of cinematic production, be it film, video, or animation. The Pac-Man is kind of considered to be the one of the first cutscenes, which are these interludes that occur between levels that are almost like little Keystone Cop comedy routines. As cutscenes became more prevalent in video games in the 90s, there was a big live-action revolution where there was this big sort of push to kind of bridge video games and movies. So we were, game developers started spending money and expenses to build real sets, have real actors like Malcolm McDowell, Mark Hamill, and Christopher Walken. They were all in Wing Commander games, and but what ended up happening is that there was a lot of criticism towards this because they weren't really affecting the game. They weren't really, they were rather separating the video game components and the story components, and so you felt like you were just watching a movie in the middle of a game. At the same time, though, I think they had an interesting effect on gamers. I think video games that began with FMV, like full motion video and splendid animation, but then when you got to the gameplay portion, it looked a lot less impressive. They were, those cutscenes, as passive as they were to experience, activated the imagination so that when you got to the gameplay, it felt like a richer world and a richer palette. Today, we don't have that problem because the technology has gotten to the point in which both the cutscenes and the gameplay elements look so fantastic and so much like each other that it becomes a much more immersive experience, even though there's still that sort of underlying criticism that cutscenes are intrusive and interfere with the flow of gameplay. So at this point, I'd like to bring up David Footman, cinematic director from Ubisoft. And David, is it okay if I show an example of your work? And this is an example of basically the work you do as a cinematic director and how it shares the very modes of filmmaking, basically the modes of production in some way that go into the production of, say, a Hollywood movie. But there's also things that are quite distinct, and we can discuss that more when we get to the panel component. But here's just a clip to set you up.
Jacobins! It is your turn to bleed!
Theremin Demericor, a revolutionary out for revenge.
We declared the rights of man, but what of women?
Robespierre names you an enemy of the Republic, harlot. You have no rights.
Jacobins had it in for Mercor. Whipped her to within an inch of her life.
The terror ends tonight!
Save a bullet for yourself. And pray you have better aim than Robespierre.
This is what's left of the Jacobins, the radical party behind the Reign of Terror. Hasn't been there a week. Maximilien Robespierre, Jacobin leader, died the night before.
Tunnels ready. Good.
The Jacobins are making their last stand here and plan to flee Paris. Infiltrate the Jacobin hideout and end the Reign of Terror.
Okay, so if everyone could welcome David Footman, we can have a conversation. So I guess the first question I want to ask you is, your background was film before you entered, and so what is just the mode of production like? I mean, there we see that you're working with performance capture, but how does that affect you creatively when you're sort of creating these cinemas?
I think I'll use this again. When I first started in the games industry, the first interview I had was with Electronic Arts, and the producer said to me, "We have a problem. We can't seem to communicate with actors, and we go in with with great intentions, and we always end up with either like really cliche or really poor performances, or really unhappy actors who didn't enjoy the process, and then we end up with results that are really bad." So the first producer said that to me and said, "Look, we need you to be our liaison between performance and the game," and I feel like that's kind of how I got into games. I think I was in film for 12 years, and what really helped me in film was that I was really technical, and I really loved computers. So the whole time I was in the film industry, I was moving towards CG, visual effects. Like I worked on the first X-Men, and then I did final, like all the Fantastic Four, and I was really steering my career towards visual effects. And because I enjoyed CG, I enjoyed graphics, I enjoyed that, they're magicians, like the stuff that they do is incredible in visual effects. So on iRobot, I just sort of lucked into this job at the beginning of this sort of technology called performance capture, which is essentially what I do, what I'm an expert at. And at the time I was working with an animation director who sort of he was the pioneer of this. So he was my mentor. And we bridged the robots in that movie with the live action, so we merged them. And then of course, when I finished the movie, I finished the movie in Los Angeles, and somebody at New Line said, "Well, we know this other production that's happening was Lord of the Rings, and they had a game that was coming out at the same time. Would you be interested in directing cinematics?" And so that's kind of what got me into gaming. And so I was hired as a talent director at first. And really it was just about taking all the elements of filmmaking and putting them in it. You called them FMVs, like full motion videos. We called them IGCs back then, in-game cinematics. So that the Lord of the Rings Third Age, I think, was an RPG. And I directed 250 scenes that are, all, performance driven, dialogue and we would have camera cuts, and they would occur throughout the game to give context and I guess emotional meaning to a segment of gameplay. So, yeah.
Can you speak to the communication between you as a cinematic director and then how the narrative might play out in the actual gameplay between those two departments? Because that's sometimes where the criticism comes for cinematics, is that there isn't that what's the word I'm looking to, synchronization,
Yeah.
where how a story plays out or narrative decisions in the game seem to contradict that of the cinematic, because cinematic sequence is passive, where arguably the gameplay is active.
Yeah, I would say, like, I've been in gaming for about 10 plus years, and in the beginning, I think I got into the games industry when there was a lot of interest in Hollywood, so there were lots of people sort of jumping over from Hollywood into gaming. So everybody was really excited, and I guess everybody in gaming loves movies, is what I've noticed, is that they're super passionate as a group about movies. And so they were really interested and excited. But then that kind of became contempt over the years, I think, because of what happened a lot on games is that there'd be these cinematics that really had nothing to do with the game, and they would kind of run off and do their own thing. And I think it was a function of the way games are made. Movies are made sort of with the director in mind. They're the visionary behind the movie, and that they pen so many aspects of the movie all sort of runs to the director. And gaming is distributed and parallel. So games, they usually have a really strong creative director, but everyone who's making the game is like this wide army of like 300 people that are marching through the game. And it does run through the creative director, but not really. There's so many people authoring the game. So when you're doing cinematics in a game, many times you don't even know what the game is because it changes so much in production. By the end of the game, I mean, I was working on Need for Speed Carbon, and 3/4 of the way through production, I'd shot everything, I'd done all the scenes, and then someone turned to me and said, "This game is about canyon racing." And I said, "What's canyon racing? I don't even know what that is." "Oh yeah, we're putting all your scenes in a canyon now." And I was, "Oh, okay, great. So what's that about?" It was totally different. So it's really agile. So like the cinematics didn't really have anything to do with the game, in that sense. We're just creating an emotional wrapper around it. So I think that that was sort of the past 5 or 6 years. You've seen a lot of games that had scenes or cinematics that didn't have a lot to do with gameplay, and I think the problem is that there were, as I said, parallel. So we weren't connected. There was no integration between story and gameplay. And I think the big change that I've seen in the last 3 years, anyway, because I just finished making cinematics for a co-op campaign for a AAA brand, and I think the big change is that as a narrative, as a director, as a narrative designer, anyone who's writing story in games, you have to essentially make the mission designer your new master. So you work for the mission designer, because story is now the player's story. And story, think of it like a screenwriter. If you write a script, story is about structure. So let's say it's a 3-act structure. Well, say I take your script and I just shuffle it and I lay it out. And is it a story anymore when you do that? And I think the answer is no, it's not a story. But in gaming, we're being asked to create experiences where we have no idea what the structure is going to be. We're just creating a whole bunch of events that the player is going to assemble into time and space and create their story. Like they're going to craft a story through their actions in the game, through their choices. So how do you tell a story in an open world environment when you have no idea what the player is going to do, when they're going to do it? And I don't have the answer to that.
I think, to me, it seems that that's why video games in the past few years feel like they've begun to emulate television more than films, and that they deal more in episodic scenarios rather than an experience. I mean, some of the text that I use, like Half-Life is a game that feels more like a movie in the sense that it is really trying to create a continuous movie ride that you're on. But as you say, the sort of prevalence of emerging gameplay forms and sandbox games, which basically say, here's a world, these are episodes that you can activate. We don't know what order you'll activate them. We know generally certain ones won't appear until other ones happen, but otherwise we can't really control that structure. It seems more like a television concept, though a television, like the idea of watching a Monster of the Week show, so that you're not but maybe out of order, like X-Files out of order or something.
Yeah, totally, and I've heard that term episodic storytelling has come out a lot, and in the co-op campaign that I just finished, we knew that we couldn't tell an arc plot, so we can't tell an arc plot over the campaign. So what story are we gonna? We're gonna tell a story within the mission, and the story is going to be revealed through the historical characters and where they intersect with the conflict of the age, and where the player, the historical character, and the conflict all intersect. There will be a story there, but I feel like just in the last couple of years, it's changing even more. I mean, I work at Ubisoft. We do a lot of open world games. I come from linear games, so it's like I either do or die. Like I am having to evolve now as a storyteller because that's not my background at all. So it's been kind of a difficult change the last couple of years because you sort of feel like you don't belong, and you don't really know like where how your expertise is needed anymore. But I guess the more I work, just this last year or two has proven it to me that it's really about story is it's distributed. It's just such a different process. It's like there's so many people impacting writing the story in a game. Even though you've written like a Bible of like what it's about, what are the themes, what is the genre, it's in the trenches, like the minute by minute experiences that are being crafted by designers that really tell the story now. And there's so many different people, and so how does that get unified, like by a strong creative director who has like a really strong vision, like pillars. So something you see in gaming more than you see in films now are really strong pre-production periods where we really nail down the pillars of the game. Like what are the pillars? What are the visual pillars? What is the controlling idea? What is our mission? What is the vision statement for the game? So that's absolutely critical in gaming. Not so much in a movie or in television when you've got this sort of central core that know it and everybody else is just doing what they do at the right time. In gaming, it's so distributed that without that central, that's what's happening in open world games. They need to have a super strong set of pillars, a really strong sort of visual vision that everybody knows, because all through production, the story is being told by those people. And it's happening when you're not looking. I'll walk by editorial and there's a storyboard artist, a writer, and an editor, and they're changing a scene, right? Which would be like, on a film, they'd all be fired, right? But this is how it works in gaming. They're like, oh, that set just got trashed. We're doing this, it doesn't work anymore. Or I walk by a scripter's desk and they're on the phone to Montreal changing something like dramatic about, it's kind of this parallel storytelling that happens. And in order to be successful at it, what I've noticed is that we come up with really strong visions, really strong, pillars for how we're telling story, and then give everyone permission around me to tell the story, right?
Do you find that maybe, this is a symptom of how big these productions are, and that in the independent space, you're seeing independent developers being able to develop more linearly focused stories? And do you think there's, I don't see that many. I find that a lot of indie games are very much emphasizing the gameplay mechanic, but I also see some games that are actually engaging in kind of cinematic storytelling. I think of games like Gone Home, in which you're exploring a house, and there's a number of cinematic cues that are kind of cueing the player into how they should be interpreting events, and then there's surprise because certain things that you expect don't actually occur, and things that seem sinister are less so. But do you find that it's because these games are simply just so gargantuan that they can't afford to have an authorial figure? And do you think that's something that should change? That do you think maybe AAA games need those bigger personalities that can kind of put that voice? And would you want to ever do that?
Yeah, I guess it depends, because it's almost like you could divide it up by genre. Like if you look at The Last of Us, we've looked at that a lot, and so it had a really strong, two very strong central figures, right? Neil, and I don't know the game designer's name of that, but when you play the game, The Last of Us, and that's a very cinematic, it's a very story-driven game. It's a masterpiece, right? It is. It's unbelievable. And the game is a reflection of those two personalities. And it's also that kind of game. It's not an open world game. It's a linear game, you're on rails, but and as you were saying, you're on rails, but you don't care that you're on rails, right?
You want to see the game
Yeah.
occur. You want to see these characters. It's the same reason when you watch a movie that you've seen a million times. There's still enjoyment because you know what the ultimate destination is, but you like these characters, and the game has endeared you to these characters through narrative storytelling techniques, through the performances, through just the very iconography of their character, and thus you want to see them enact, and you want to be the one responsible for that action. You want to be able to press that button and have the character, go over the hill.
Yeah, it's amazing. I played the game twice now, and it was playing it a second time, I had an even better experience.
Well, that's interesting. Do you find that when you play, because that's another, that brings me sort of back to this idea that, well, in cinema, it's this static object, and in games it's this active, interactive object that you're able to change and adjust about, and I'm sort of inside that, well, you can and you can't because there's kind of a destination. But at the same time, in films, there are movies that behave as puzzles, so that multiple times you watch a movie, you're not getting the same experience either. That's something that happens in, say, a film like last year, Bad. It's like a movie. You can't watch that movie the same way because it's a fractured narrative, and every time you watch it, your mind is kind of emphasizing another sort of plot thread. And it's the same, I feel, in games where every playthrough is going to be a unique experience, but at the same time, there's still this kind of game ideal, maybe, like this idea that there's this hypothetical playthrough of how a game, that's what I think about sometimes, especially in these cinematic games. It's almost like they're imagining what would be the perfect playthrough of this game. And we realize that not every player is going to achieve that, but they're going to get enough of those moments that it's going to feel like a satisfying experience. But when they return to it again, I think what's interesting is when I return to games, I often try to repeat those perfect moments that happened the first time because I want to see them again.
And you can sometimes.
Yeah,
right?
sometimes you can.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an example in Final Fantasy VI. There's these dreams that are hidden in the game that the moment I discovered that they existed, I can't play through that game without, I have to unlock all those dreams. I have to experience that part of the narrative again, even though it's a completely non-essential part of the narrative. It's not something that is required to understand the context of the story, but it becomes something that I discovered through my playthrough. It's how I experience that story, and thus I need to see those cinematics again. I need to perform those moments again.
Yeah, I think that what I'm noticing, especially at Ubisoft with the games that we're making in terms of story, it's we're making open world games, and it's really hard, really hard to make open world games that have, I'll say, meaningful story, because meaningful story contains structure. So it's always, even though it's open world, there's always a campaign, and there's going to be structure in that campaign or whatever. But it feels like what games, where they're going, where everyone wants to take games, is into systems, my interpretation of it is it's about causality and player identity. So players are asserting their identity by taking actions and making choices in the in this world, and then telling their own story. And meaning we're actually starting to get the technology. We're starting to understand how to use the technology to have more emergent gameplay opportunities, but to also have story that's emergent, which is kind of like the Matrix, right? Like all of a sudden, so we're not there yet, but that's what everyone's pointing their boats at right now.
Though I think what's interesting is that even something like the Matrix is still a system of control, and so despite the choices that you're afforded, I mean, that's like the theme of that movie, which is just that despite being offered this plethora of choices, these choices are predetermined. We know the various choices, that there's a finite amount of them, and it's just a question of whether or not those choices have an emotional sort of reaction. Because I mean, and that is the problem with open world games. You can play Grand Theft Auto and decide I'm just going to drive around and be a psycho and just mess up the place.
Yeah, and it becomes what is that, spectacle, or does it mean and it's just spectacle, right?
Yeah.
And so you're not really. What do you change?
And it can really frustrate the story. Like LA Noire is a good example where a lot of people were like, this game it takes so much time to create a fully realized cinematic world, but the moment you step into a car, you're running people over by accident because of the mechanics of the driving in that game, and suddenly you feel like, I'm a crazy detective that no one is arresting.
Yeah.
And that's why often it makes more sense in open world games for the characters to be criminals, to be outside the law, just as it makes sense in certain, I find in a lot of heavily cinematic games for characters to be soldiers, because if the game wants you to follow the rules, it casts you as a character that should be following the rules. If the game is in an open world context, I find that then it makes sense for the character to be anarchic, and that's why even in the new Grand Theft Auto, the character that a lot of players seem to respond to is the hillbilly, the one that's just completely chaos. So I think that's that. But then I can think of another example that I thought mediated it pretty interesting. I don't know if you ever played Deadly Premonition.
No.
But in that game, it had the same problem as LA Noire in that you've got these cutscenes that are sort of explaining the story, and then when you're driving around, you can potentially crash into things and make a mess of the world. But your character is actually cast as a kind of a crazy person who is having conversations with you as the player, and so there's already this sort of mental imbalance in the character itself that they've created, so you kind of hand wave everything and you go, well, this character is weird, this character is such an odd individual that maybe he does do this, and so you can kind of suture yourself back into the story even though there's all these elements that are kind of contradicting with the cinematics. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Do you have, as the Ubisoft company, do you have to take Oculus Rift, which is a technology that's being released, and how well the playable components, directing scenes interact with the technology?
So the question is about the Oculus Rift. Have you had any experience working with Oculus Rift and how that affects? Because it's great that you brought that up. I was going to bring it up before we concluded because Oculus Rift just appeared at Sundance and had a big splash there. And that's the thing we're beginning to see. Video games are actually entering the space of film festivals like this one. But 2 years ago, LA Noire was at Tribeca, and Oculus Rift was at Sundance, and we're getting virtual filmmakers now, people who are making films and documentaries in a virtual space. Can you speak to Oculus?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a big, we have a technology group with a whole division, right, that's dedicated to new technologies in the Oculus, and lots of dev kits. So it's definitely a big part of our future production. So we're building games for all the consoles, and that's not something that I'm having any experience with. I'm not working as a developer with any Oculus products right now or any development cycles, but we have a lot. I think we have 3 or 4 at our studio dev kits that people are using to concept and design.
But how do you think that this technology will change the meaning of series, meaning movie as a...
How will this technology change meaning, or maybe even just cinematic language? Because I can see an Oculus Rift having cinematics.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's kind of like the first job I ever had in gaming was a first-person POV cinematic game, and I hated it. I wasn't a big first-person fan. I didn't want to have all the actors staring at the camera. So I definitely think that it's kind of an extension of that first-person experience, right? For cinematics. I mean, the immersion, it's insane. I mean, I think that, I don't know, even thinking about it in terms of experientially, how is it going to change what I do, cinematics, it's just going to make it more immersive, it's going to make it more real. I'm not sure how it would change them conceptually, anyway, what I do.
What I think is interesting is that I got to experience one game called or not a game, but rather an experience called Ascent, which was at Sundance, and it's basically kind of a documentary in which you're in a visual sort of digital representation of an actual place in Chile in which there was a massacre occurred, and you're just seeing someone taking you through the space and telling you what happened, and the game is the audio of the game is actually creating the sound of that massacre and what happened, and it's incredibly Chilean and traumatizing to kind of go through that experience. But it's in a form that video games haven't really engaged with. This is a form of documentary, and actually being able to document spaces and to create experiences that happen in the real world in order to tell stories, which I think is kind of new ground.
Yeah, and I guess if you look at even what the Oculus, or in terms of virtual reality, how it's sort of changed our production. One thing we do quite well in Toronto is we have a performance capture stage. It's a volume where we do all our animation and capture all our actors. But what we've been doing for the last couple of projects is after I shoot all the scenes for a game, I'll order the data. We'll put it together into a scene, so do it into a full assembly, and then I'll send it down to the performance capture stage with all of the environments and the skeletons and the characters. Then I'll go down to the stage with a cameraman, and we have a virtual camera. So we'll walk into the middle of the volume, and if you fire up the camera and you look on the monitor, and you've got all of your actors waiting at their start mark in the set, waiting, right? So then you say, okay, action, and the actors run the scene. And now you're in the scene with your camera, and you can just walk around and you can view the scene. So they're like right in front of me, or I can sort of move around. And so you can actually go in afterwards and virtually film the shoot, like coverage. So I'll be like, okay, well, give me a 35 mil. So we work in primes, so I'll have a set of primes. So give me a 35 mil lens, and I'd like to be on a virtual dolly. And so they'll put me on a virtual dolly. So now on the camera, I'm moving across the stage, and I'll say action, and I'll shoot. And if I get a good, the PCAP volume is recording my camera data. So you'll just go through and you'll just shoot the whole scene virtually for an hour, and then send the data up. You'll remap the cameras into the game, and then you'll have it runtime afterwards. And obviously, it's just one way of authoring cameras, but it's you as a director, as a cameraman, you experience it differently because you're in there. You kind of it really feels
it's
like
a really surreal experience. Yeah. I mean, how does that affect editing decisions or editing patterns in games? Because you're not limited by film stock. You're able to just literally shoot a continuous moment. So when you're actually assembling these, what is kind of driving the curatorial decisions in terms of when you're cutting? And
we like to separate it by discipline. So I have a camera team that'll shoot it, and it'll go to an editor, and they would go through it, and they just call it coverage. So, and then we'll work with the editor to find the right sort of flow for the assembly. But definitely the fact that you can do anything it's hard sometimes to make choices, because it's like, well, mostly I think over the past 5 years, we've been informed by making our cameras realistic. So no one would ever look at one of my video game cameras from the last couple of games and say, oh, that's a video game camera, right? Where I just created a node and a spline, and I have a camera on a spline, so it looks like a fake camera. Kind of like when you watch some of those big effects movies, they're doing the opposite. Like you see a Michael Bay movie, and there's this crazy camera, and I'm like, oh, that looks like a CG camera. Well, they don't care. I'm not allowed to do a CG camera because, of course, we're working in CG, and we're trying to create this sort of, heaviness and reality around the camera.
That's what's interesting, because it does seem like both mediums are kind of converging in opposite directions. And it even seems that, films I feel are beginning to, big blockbuster movies are beginning to be assembled more like video game productions, in the sense that you have all these assets that are all going off at once. And a movie like Transformers is not even about the story, it's about the various episodes. I'm sure you can watch that movie out of order, and it makes as much coherent sense as it did before. Yeah, it just doesn't necessarily have the same kind of arc, but at the same time, you've just got just episodes of set pieces that just are connected.
Well, I think that cinematically, we're ending the period where we want to be just like movies, and we're sort of growing. I'm going to say, as a game cinematic director, we're entering the phase now where we're not trying to emulate or copy or hide the fact that we're in gaming. And I think we're going into the stage now in terms of cinematics and story that we're going to be, we're in video game development, and we're proud of it. Like this, I'm not going to try to make this look like The Wire, or this camera style is going to be like this or that, whatever. So I actually am looking forward to my first, game camera that, like this really this impossible camera that could never do it. I'm like, I'm looking forward to trying that on a game, saying, well, I'm in video games, I can do whatever I want,
Do you find in the industry there are other cinematic directors like yourselves that actually have a kind of authorial signature that you can kind of look and go like, oh, I know who directed this stuff. There's it fits his sensibility and this is his style. Or do you have a style?
I think that really, the reason I'm in gaming is that I came from film. So I'm mostly brought in as a talent director, working with talent and working, I say I create meaning and story around gameplay when I'm allowed to, because a big part of the game is like an interactive game, where the player is navigating and doing everything. So I think I would say that what my like signature has been just very cinematic. Lots of, I run my studio through a regular sort of pipeline, or a pipeline that is very much like a film pipeline. I run my shoots like a film, because I come from film. I run everything like a film. So I bring in all the professionals that do audio, boom, camera guys. So I have it divided up by discipline, from camera to editor to audio, all the way through. I'm just basically mirroring the filmic production because it really works. Like it's been working forever. And then on top of that, we're blending in sort of as the technology makes it available, all the sort of new abilities we have with cinematic. So that's logic. Like imagine that I can create a scene around some characters, and I'll create animation trees for an NPC character. So the character will have like a bunch of different possibilities based on player action. So that's kind of the new space that we're moving into. And that's kind of that sort of me is the scary space, because you're, as a talent director, as a performance capture director, I work in a volume, and I create performances in time and space that are linear. You push play, but gaming is going towards procedural animation. It's going towards animation logic, where you'll have an actor that'll animate a skeleton, but then you'll animate several performances, and I need to be able to blend in and out of those in real time on the fly, to create the illusion of, not the illusion, to reflect the causality of the game. The player made a choice. I don't know, like you're in a map and you're a vegetarian. You go to a butcher shop and kill everybody because that's who you are, right? So we need those people to react to what the player chose to do, or whatever it is. So all of that requires logic, working with AI teams, and like really super technical sort of animation. And it's kind of I'm comfortable with it because I think I'm really interested in it, but it's really hard and really difficult. And you're kind of, as a director, even as an actor, if you're working that, you're sort of, the performance isn't you anymore, and the performance isn't me anymore. It's a collage of sort of people, or technology anyway.
I'm going to offer it up to the audience in a second. The one question I also had was about, do you find that the cinematography of the game and the cinematography of the cinematics are ever sort of, are you having those type of conversation? Which, how does the camera behave in the game? Yeah. How does it behave in the cinematic? Totally. And how are we synchronizing that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, whenever we start a game, that's one of the first things we do is we create a camera language. We pick our primes, and that's gameplay and cinematics. So there'll be a language that we will define, and then we will respect that as we go through. So, the language might be that the camera is aware. So you've seen when the player is navigating their character, you can have the camera be affected, like Children of Men. Like a lot of the camera work was affected by explosions and things like that. So, which kind of is perfect for games, because we can animate the camera, but we can layer animate the camera, so that as an additional layer on top of that, like Gears of War, like the run camera, when you would run, it would get really frenetic and.
Yeah, it feels like someone is actually behind you.
It's
that abstract, like the turtle in the cloud. There's actually a turtle in the cloud that's following you around.
Totally. So we go through a whole process where we come up with the camera language, and then from that we create a design document, and then it has to go to tech group so that we can figure out, how do we pull this off? Like, how are we creating, like, we have a camera language, and the game needs to have programmers sort of make that happen, in the game. So I think it's similar to what would happen on a film. They'll choose a language, and whether they chose it or whether they're hiring somebody from, like a DP who has a language that they want to work with, a way of shooting.
Questions? Yep.
It's actually just a comment, but I thought it was pretty neat. The antagonist in the Assassin's Creed clip, Adam Brown, is actually from here.
Oh.
No way. Yeah, we used that was what was different on this project. On AC, I used more theater actors than I've ever used before, and my goal was to use all local Toronto people, Toronto actors, and the other goal I had was that I wanted every actor I worked with to be able to play 3 roles. Yeah. So you had to be able to play 3 roles, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Like I'm not cheap. That wasn't really the reason, but in performance capture, the more cast you have on a shoot day, it just kills you because there's a lot of technology. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen before you can actually do the capture. So there's the initialization, like with we have to get everybody markered up, everybody in the volume, and then we need to do like a lot of sort of data quality control techniques because it's an optical volume where we're tracking thousands of markers on lots of actors. So what I noticed was, and I noticed this when I was working on Dead Space, and I was shooting at House of Moose in LA, and we had lots of, we were block shooting, we had lots and lots of different performers and lots of actors, and I think one day I had 17 actors, and I think I shot for like 2.5 hours. And I was like, okay, well, this isn't gonna work. On AC, we had tons of different characters, but a lot of them were really small, like little vignettes where we were just sort of reenacting something that happened in history, where we really had to like, our rule, which is a common rule, which is bad people do bad things. So bad people don't say bad things. So all of our historical characters that were in missions had to take action, to provoke the player to do something in the mission. So I had lots of little vignettes of different historical characters. So it made more sense for me to say, okay, I would look for an actor that I knew could play 3 roles, and we would change their voice if we had to. The unexpected boost was that the actors loved it. Like they absolutely loved it. Everybody was just so on fire to get to play different roles.
And I can see how theater actors might be more open to that kind of play too.
Oh yeah. We had we had lots of theater gods, as my casting director called them, come and play with us, and it helped. I think that the dialect that we chose was a very difficult dialect. We had a dialect coach, so working with theater made that a little easier. Yes?
Kind of just a question about the intersection of cinema and gaming. When I think of games recently like that, I think of like the Telltale games or Beyond Two Souls, which are very much, you have like 4 choices and it's very limited. And it seems kind of like a step back to come to like the cinema level from what is possible. Like if you look at the Assassin's Creed game, like the like possibilities are huge. Whereas if you play like the Walking Dead game, you kind of get the same ending each time. It seems like a very primitive, almost choose your own adventure way of storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it feels like we could look at it as sort of a primitive form of storytelling, but it's also like a kind of cinema. Like that's simply like, and as a gamer, I actually kind of like linear experience games. I actually like being sort of told a story, but it's not the only possibility, and that's why the industry is kind of exploring new forms sort of emerging stories. But I totally see what you mean. Yeah, it kind of feels like, oh, these are just adventure games. We had those 20 years ago. Like we had LucasArts adventure games, which are just kind of like very simple binary choices, and more or less the ending is the same, even though maybe not all the characters made it the whole way there. But I think that's just a type of, just as like the novel didn't become extinct, I don't think movies are going to be replaced by video games, and I don't think, I think there's just going to be many different kinds of cinema because the media, many different kinds of video games, just as there's many different kinds of cinema because the medium just affords different types of expression. And so one expression could be these linear experiences with finite choices. Another expression could be the sort of emergent gameplay that we've been discussing. I think what's important is just that they're still mediating and creating meaning through a visual grammar and a grammar that is not even on a visual sense, but like a plastic sort of physical grammar that's occurring. I don't know if that really answers the question, but it's kind of like how I feel when faced with that situation.
Have you heard that And so Nike, I just read it somewhere that Nike is allowing people who want to buy their shoes to design their own shoes. There's some kind of, I don't know what it's called. But I think there's some kind of there's a big cultural connection with what's going on in games, with what you see going on everywhere. It's like, this is my experience. I'm on Facebook or social media and Twitter, whatever. I have my experience and I'm sharing it with everybody. Everybody wants to have, their own experience. So I think that, in a big way, you're seeing that sort of go into games, and a lot of games are about that. They're about giving people the opportunity to have an experience and to share it, like just something that simple.
But I think even that was kind of what was the popular appeal and attraction to cinema. When cinema began, I think the appeal eventually, like especially by the time it really became sort of a fully fleshed out medium, people were going to movies to get access to experiences they weren't going through in their own lives, or to see experiences they had gone through and see it as sort of a mirror, and being able to kind of go like, oh yeah, that's how I felt. And video games have that ability to create similar moments, like, yeah, this is not only how I felt, this is what I did in that situation, or this is what it might feel like if I were in that situation.
Well, and the story, and it really comes down to, like, there's all this discussion of what is a story, like what story are you telling? Like, is it a story if I am playing Far Cry and I get on a or I get on an elephant and I start shooting everyone in a village with a rocket launcher? Like, is that a story? And everyone, they're saying that's a story. I think it's debatable, but it's a spectacle. I mean, what changed? Being a storyteller, that's something that I've had a hard time coming to terms with them, because I'm always trying to create a meaningful, structure in some story or something in anything I've ever done. And whereas like a lot of people are talking about this idea of story being something you do and share, and that's something that I'm just wrapping my head around in the gaming industry right now, anyway, to see how
Why do you think story gets sacrificed, even though they have a Bible and everything sort of set up? Why do you think it's constantly? It's never something that they hold true to through the whole process of a game, that they're constantly kind of changing and adjusting. Like, why do you think that happens in games?
I think it's because gameplay is king, right? So that's it. So everyone is there because of the gameplay, and if it doesn't matter how great the story is, if the gameplay isn't great, then it's sunk and everything's finished. So, and I think that's true. So, and I think a lot of gaming is really iterative, like more so than movies. Like the game I started making in a 3-year cycle is so different from the game we finished at the end. I think that's a good thing, because we're all adapting. So that's kind of the changes I've made to my team were giving permission so that other people can tell the story. It's not all running through me. Strong pillars, strong vision statement to align everybody so that we can have integration. And then working with people that know the mechanics of story. Story is about reversal. Story is about change. Story is about, there's all the minutiae that create story. So then we need to arm the mission designers and the game designers with all of these tools in order to create experience in the game. And then hopefully there's a creative director that's tuning into that. That can be like the maestro to create more meaningful experiences across all of the gameplay. Like happens with a lot of these auteurs, right? And when games first started, and with cinema. So I'm super glad that it's moving away from. I mean, the opening for Splinter Cell Blacklist, when we were working on that, we worked really hard to get it down to the right length, because people want to play the game. So
I actually have it here if you want to.
I don't know if they want to play it, but people want to play the game, so you're on a timer, right? So you're creating context, you're trying to answer the question, why? Why is Sam Fisher, why does he have to take these steps, right, to bring change to the world? And it's hard because people going in, they want to play the game, they want to learn the mechanics, they want everything. So you're on a timer. And then what's cool is that I think those are getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter, which is great. And story and all that meaning is happening in the gameplay now, right? Which I think is a huge step forward.
Yes.
So you talked a little bit about how during a game you'll have to sometimes create different elements of the story
I don't know about the film world, but I mean, I'm seeing it in commercials already. There's a host of new commercials that are using, I guess, the new HTML, and you're able to snap to different perspectives. I don't know, is it the car commercial? Is that the one? Is that Honda or who? Honda, yeah. Which I think that's mind blowing. Right?
I remember that was kind of the promise of technology on DVD, where it was like alternate angles. And the whole concept was like, yeah, you could switch to a different angle in the movie.
Yeah.
Which never really manifested in any sort of satisfying way. I remember they actually were intending to do that with Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, and they ended up settling for like some weird editing, like fake editing suite. But yeah, the idea was that because it was like a digital, fully digital realized world, yeah, you could on the PlayStation 2 like freeze the film and move the camera around and kind of investigate different spaces. I mean, a game like Gone Home, which is an independent game where a character just visits a house and explores a house, and you can kind of get all the narrative information you need in roughly 40 minutes, feels like you're watching a short feature, and it affords you. It feels like to play. I've played that game a few times, and when I play it again, it's like watching a film. I know where everything is. I just like experiencing those moments, but I can choose to experience and move through that world differently every time I play it.
It's like the Uncharted game. Like the Uncharted game, you don't really have much choice. You're going through. It's just a full round movie.
Yeah.
I think the ads literally sold it as such. Like they were like, oh my, people are confused that this is not a game; that they think it's a movie. There was one at the back first.